The Lancaster mansion was radiant that night. Golden lights illuminated the impeccably manicured gardens, and luxury cars stopped one by one at the entrance, bringing the city's most important guests. It was the event of the year, and everyone who mattered was there. Elizabeth Lancaster, the youngest of the family, looked stunning in her wine-red dress. With every step she took, eyes turned to her and smiles opened in her direction. At just 22 years old, Elizabeth was the darling of the family, the darling of the tycoon Charles Lancaster, her father. Always surrounded by luxury and privileges, it seemed like the whole world revolved around her. Outside, away from the laughter and clinking of glasses, a figure watched. From behind the shadows, the dark-skinned woman with dirty clothes and a determined look had been there for hours. She didn't seem to fit into that opulent setting, but she hadn't come for that. She knew that night would be decisive. Inside the mansion, the party continued at a gala pace. Charles, with his imposing presence and calculated smile, moved among the guests, distributing words of courtesy. He was the picture of success, the man everyone admired or feared. At his side, Elizabeth shone like a star, unaware of what was going on in her father's mind. But as the champagne flowed and the tunes filled the room, something seemed out of place. The air was heavy, as if a storm was about to brew. No one was sure why, but even the laughter seemed muffled. That's when, for a brief moment, Charles stopped. From the top of the staircase, he looked outside, through the glass windows that looked out onto the garden. His eyes narrowed and the smile disappeared. Something or someone out there captured your attention. He quickly looked away, but not before Elizabeth noticed. "Everything okay, Dad?" she asked, placing her hand gently on his arm. Charles, with the skill of someone used to covering up emotions, opened a forced smile and replied, "Everything is perfect, my dear. Go enjoy your night." Elizabeth hesitated, but eventually complied. As she returned to her friends, Charles remained motionless, staring into the darkness outside. Whoever it was, he knew that presence was no accident. Outside, the woman watched patiently. She knew that man more than he realized. Her heart was racing, but not from fear. She was there for something she had been planning for years. That night, amid laughter and champagne, the masks would begin to fall, and no one was prepared for what was to come. While the party inside the mansion continued with laughter and lively conversations, outside, the silence in the garden seemed to scream. The woman remained in the shadows, watching everything carefully. Every laugh that echoed through the night was like a blow to his memories. She shouldn't be there. That party, that place, that man, none of it was for her. But at the same time, everything there was part of its history. Her name was Grace. She was far from being the woman she once dreamed of being. His face, marked by time and years of suffering, seemed to carry every tear, every sleepless night, every injustice he had endured. And in that moment, looking at the bright windows of the Lancaster mansion, she knew she needed to move on. That night wasn't about the guests or the luxury. It was about the truth. Inside the mansion, Charles Lancaster tried to concentrate on the party. He talked to important businessmen and laughed at the right moments, but his mind was far away. The image of that woman in the garden never left his head. He'd caught a glimpse of her, but it was enough to make his stomach turn. Could it be her? No, I couldn't. It had been so long. She wouldn't have the courage. Elizabeth, on the other hand, was at the center of the party, completely oblivious to her father's concerns. She danced with friends, receiving compliments for her beauty and charisma. She was the life of the party, and everyone around her seemed enchanted. But amidst so many admiring looks, Elizabeth felt something different. For a brief moment, as she looked at the glass door that led to the garden, she had the feeling that someone was watching her. He turned quickly, but saw nothing but darkness outside. "Everything is fine?" asked one of his friends, noticing her lost look. "Yes, it's okay." Elizabeth smiled, but she couldn't get the strange feeling out of her head. It was as if something invisible was about to happen. Meanwhile, Grace approached, little by little. Every step was a fight against the ghosts of the past. She knew that if she was seen by security, she would be removed by force. But at the same time, she felt that nothing could stop her anymore. For years, she had carried that weight alone. Years when she had been ignored, humiliated, and forgotten. Today, she would not be silent. Charles, restless, went to the balcony. He needed to confirm. I needed to look again. When he reached the balcony railing, he took a deep breath and looked out at the garden. But there was nothing, just darkness and the distant sound of the party. "I'm getting paranoid," he thought. Still, an uncomfortable feeling persisted. He knew that if it really was Grace, she wasn't there by chance. The past, he learned, always finds a way to return. Grace, hidden behind a tree, watched him. When her eyes met the man who destroyed her life, a chill ran down her spine. She clenched her fists and closed her eyes for a moment. He remembered who he was, what he lost, and why he had come. This was no time to hesitate. Back in the hall, Elizabeth felt that discomfort again. This time, he decided to act. He grabbed a glass of champagne and walked towards the glass doors. Something outside was calling her, but she didn't know what. When she opened the door, the cool night air enveloped her, and she took a few steps outside. Grace, in the distance, saw the young woman in the wine-red dress. For a moment, her eyes filled with tears. It was her. There was no doubt. Even after so many years, Grace would recognize that face anywhere. But before Elizabeth could take another step, Charles appeared in the doorway. "Elizabeth!" he called, his voice firmer than he intended. "Come in. There's nothing out there." Elizabeth hesitated, but obeyed. Meanwhile, on the other side of the garden, Grace retreated into the shadows. It wasn't the time yet, but inside her a promise burned. "You will listen to me, Charles, and so will she. This time, no one will silence me." The night continued at the same pace as always for the guests of the Lancaster mansion. Toasts, exaggerated laughter, and the soft chords of a jazz band filling the room. But for Charles, something was off. The man, who rarely showed weakness, walked from one side to the other with a closed expression, different from the usual calculated smile he displayed at events like this. Elizabeth, on the other hand, tried to ignore the discomfort she had felt when going out into the garden. Despite the champagne and lively conversations, something about that night felt off. She couldn't forget her father's worried look on the porch, nor the strange impulse she felt as she opened the doors to the garden. Meanwhile, Grace remained in the shadows, breathing deeply and trying to stay focused. Every corner of the mansion stirred memories in her, memories she had spent years trying to forget. The same mansion that now gleamed with opulence had been for her a prison 20 years ago. At that time, Grace was young, full of dreams, and completely at the mercy of Charles Lancaster. She closed her eyes, and for a moment, the memories came back like a sharp blow. Charles' office, where he called her with that tone that mixed authority and something darker, the weight of false promises, brutality disguised as kindness, and then, the worst of all, the loss that ripped his soul in half. When her baby was ripped from her arms, Grace knew her life would never be the same. Back in the present, she clenched her fists, feeling her anger rising. The party continued at a festive pace, but she knew that moment wouldn't last forever. That night she would no longer be a shadow in the garden. She was going to be heard, whether Charles wanted it or not. In the ballroom, Elizabeth finally decided she needed answers. Charles had been behaving strangely all night, and she wanted to understand why. He found his father alone in a corner, holding a glass of whiskey and staring at a painting on the wall, as if he wanted to disappear into it. "Father?" Elizabeth called softly, trying not to alarm him. Charles turned quickly, as if he had been caught in the act. "Yes, my dear?" he replied, trying to compose his expression. "Is there a problem?" "I should ask that. You've been weird all night. What is happening?" Charles hesitated. The last thing he wanted was to involve Elizabeth in this story. She was the light of his life, the symbol of everything he had achieved. But at the same time, he knew that Grace's presence there was not something he could ignore. Not for long. "Nothing, darling. Just business. You know how it is." He tried to smile, but Elizabeth wasn't convinced. "Business? In the middle of a party?" She raised her eyebrows. "Don't fool me, Father. I know there's something more." Before Charles could respond, one of the mansion's servants approached. "Mr. Lancaster, there is a woman outside. She insists on speaking to you. He said he won't leave until he sees him." Charles froze. His heart raced in his chest, but he tried to remain calm. He knew exactly who was waiting for him outside. "Tell me I don't know any woman like that, and send her away immediately." The employee nodded, but hesitated before leaving. Elizabeth, curious, couldn't hold her tongue. "Who is she, Dad? Why do you look so worried?" he asked, crossing his arms. "Nobody," Charles responded quickly, maybe too fast. "Just some opportunist trying to cause trouble. Now go back to your friends, honey. Don't worry about that." But Elizabeth knew something was wrong. She had never seen her father so nervous, so vulnerable, and that bothered her more than she wanted to admit. Outside, Grace didn't move. When the employee showed up to try to send her away, she simply ignored him. He wasn't the one she wanted to talk to. She was there for Charles and for Elizabeth. "I'm not going anywhere," he thought firmly. "This story will not end quietly." Meanwhile, inside the mansion, the seeds of doubt began to grow in Elizabeth's heart. She didn't know exactly what was happening, but she felt like that night was far from just a party. The glitter of the party continued to enchant the guests, but for Charles Lancaster, the night was turning into a nightmare. He was tense, restless, as if he carried an invisible weight on his shoulders. Try as he might, he couldn't concentrate on anything the guests were saying. The laughter and toasts around him became just a distant noise. Outside, Grace remained motionless, firm in her decision not to leave. The employee's words did not intimidate her. She knew she would face resistance, but she had already endured much more than that in her life. 20 years of silence, pain, and humiliation. Today, I would no longer be silent. Elizabeth, who was increasingly suspicious, watched her father from afar. Something was wrong, very wrong. He wasn't the cold, controlled man she knew. There was something behind that distant look and that failed attempt to disguise nervousness. For the first time, she felt that perhaps she didn't know her father as well as she thought she did. Meanwhile, Grace took advantage of the waiter's departure to move on. With calculated steps, he crossed the garden until he reached the main entrance. The mansion shone before her, like a wall separating two worlds. The luxurious world of the Lancasters, where everything was perfect and controlled, and theirs, marked by deep wounds and memories that were difficult to erase. At the door, 2 security guards approached, clearly uncomfortable with her presence. Grace lifted her chin and maintained a firm posture. "I'm here to speak to Charles Lancaster. He knows who I am." His voice was full of determination, and for the first time that night she realized that fear no longer had room in her heart. The security guards exchanged glances, unsure of what to do. Before they could react, the door opened. It was Elizabeth. "What's going on here?" he asked, with an expression of curiosity and slight irritation. His eyes immediately fell on Grace, and for a moment she hesitated. Something about the woman seemed familiar, but he couldn't explain why. "Miss Lancaster, don't worry. We are dealing with it." One of the security guards tried to intervene, but Grace wasted no time. "Elizabeth," she said, with a voice that seemed to carry all the weight of the world. The young woman's name left her lips with an intimacy that left everyone disconcerted. "Please listen to me." Elizabeth frowned, confused. That woman didn't seem like a threat, but there was something about the way she called her that made her uncomfortable. Before she could respond, Charles appeared behind her with quick steps and an expression that mixed anger and panic. "I told you to go away," he shouted, pointing at Grace. "You are not welcome here." Grace didn't back down. For the first time in many years, he looked into the eyes of the man who had destroyed his life. His voice was firm, full of emotion. "You can scream all you want, Charles, but I'm not leaving. I came to tell the truth, and she needs to know." Grace pointed to Elizabeth, who was looking at the two of them, not understanding anything. "What truth? What is she talking about, Dad?" Elizabeth asked, taking a step back. His voice was shaky but full of curiosity. "Nothing," Charles responded quickly, his voice louder than he intended. "This woman is just a crazy person who doesn't know her place. Don't listen to her." Grace felt her blood boil. She had waited years for this moment, and she would not be silenced again. "Crazy?" she repeated, laughing bitterly. "You called me crazy when you took my daughter from me, Charles." "He called me crazy when I begged for justice, but the one who really lost his mind was you. Now I'm here, and no one will shut me up." Elizabeth looked at her father in shock. What was she listening to? What daughter was this Grace was talking about? The young woman felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. "Dad, what is she saying?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper, but Charles, instead of responding, turned to the security guards. "Get this woman out of here." "Now!" The security guards hesitated for a moment but complied. As they approached, Grace took one last look at Elizabeth. "You deserve to know the truth," she said, her eyes teary. "Don't let him fool you. He is not the man you think." Elizabeth stood frozen as the security guards took Grace back to the garden. His mind was confused, and his heart was full of doubts. Who was that woman, and why did she feel that this was just the beginning of something much bigger? Inside the mansion, Charles closed the door tightly and turned to his daughter. "Don't listen to her. These people just want to destroy what we have." He tried to sound convincing, but Elizabeth realized there was more to the story. Much more. Outside in the dark garden, Grace watched as the mansion's lights shone like unreachable stars. She knew it would be difficult. He knew Charles would fight to keep everything hidden, but that night, a seed of doubt had been planted, and she wouldn't give up until the truth was revealed. Elizabeth couldn't get the image of that woman out of her head. Grace's words echoed like an incessant whisper, penetrating his certainties like a knife. Who was she? What was that story about a daughter? And why was his father so nervous? She had always believed that Charles Lancaster was an unshakable, confident man, the kind of person who could control any situation. But that night, something in him had broken, and that made her uncomfortable. While the guests were still toasting and laughing in the ballroom, Elizabeth discreetly walked away, her footsteps echoing through the halls. He found a quiet corner near the mansion's library, away from prying eyes. I needed a moment to breathe, to think. On the other side of the house, Charles was visibly shaken. He went to his office, closed the door tightly, and poured himself another glass of whiskey. He sat down in the leather armchair and rested his head in his hands, trying to organize his thoughts. He knew that Grace wouldn't show up for no reason. She was persistent, stubborn, and most of all, dangerous. The mere idea that she could ruin everything he had built over the years made him furious. Why did she have to come back now, he thought, his fingers gripping the glass so hard that it seemed about to break. He knew that Grace had always been a strong woman, but he never imagined that she would be bold enough to face him again, especially here, in your own home. Elizabeth, still in the library, tried to ignore the knot she felt in her stomach. She needed to understand what was happening. He took out his cell phone and quickly typed the woman's name into Google, but as expected, he found nothing. Grace was a complete stranger. This only increased the feeling that something was very wrong. Suddenly, the library door opened, and Elizabeth almost dropped her cell phone. It was his mother, Victoria Lancaster. Always elegant, Victoria had the air of a queen, but was also known for her coldness. "What are you doing here, darling?" Victoria asked, frowning when she noticed her daughter's lost expression. "I just needed a moment to think." Elizabeth tried to hide it, but her mother knew her too well to believe it. Victoria approached, her heels echoing on the marble floor. "It's because of that woman, isn't it?" he asked, his voice low but full of authority. Elizabeth's eyes widened. "So you know who she is?" Victoria hesitated for a moment, and that was enough for Elizabeth to realize that there was more to the story than she realized. "I don't know exactly who she is," Victoria replied, looking away. "But it seems to be someone from your father's past, someone who shouldn't be here." "And what does she want?" Elizabeth insisted, taking a step forward. She talked about a daughter he would have taken from her. "What does this mean?" Victoria sighed and looked into her daughter's eyes. For a moment he looked like he was going to say something, but then he shook his head. "That's none of your business, Elizabeth. This woman clearly wants to cause trouble. Don't let her put ideas in your head." His voice was firm, but Elizabeth detected a trace of nervousness. It wasn't like Victoria to avoid a question like that. "Mom, I deserve to know. If there's something my father is hiding, I have a right to know." Elizabeth crossed her arms, determined. "Don't talk about your father like that," Victoria replied, more forcefully than she intended. "He did everything for this family. Don't forget that." Before Elizabeth could respond, Victoria left the library, leaving her daughter alone again. Elizabeth felt a chill. If her mother was trying to protect her father, that only meant there was more buried than she realized. Outside, Grace was still in the garden, now sitting on a bench under the surveillance of security guards. His patience seemed infinite. She knew that Charles would try to hush up the situation, but she also knew that night something had changed. She had planted a doubt in Elizabeth's mind, and that was enough to start. "She'll find out. No matter what they do, she'll know the truth," thought Grace, as the night wind gently ruffled her hair. He looked at the mansion one last time before getting up. Meanwhile, in the office, Charles picked up the phone and made a call. His voice was low but full of urgency. "She's here. I need you to take care of this. Now." The night at the Lancaster mansion seemed to be divided into two worlds. In the main hall, guests continued toasting, dancing, and enjoying the delicacies on offer. But in the shadows of that glamorous party, secrets began to move. Each of the characters involved was filled with a growing restlessness. Elizabeth couldn't sit still. That woman's words, his father's nervousness, and his mother's evasiveness swirled in his mind like a whirlwind. Something very wrong was happening, and she knew she wouldn't find easy answers. I needed to act. He picked up his bag and walked discreetly through the corridors, ignoring the curious looks of some employees. She decided to return to the garden. Something about that woman had moved her deeply. The familiarity she felt when hearing her name leaving his lips still bothered her. Who was that person, and what did she know about her family? When he reached the door that led outside, he hesitated. What if her father found out she was talking to that woman? Charles's angry look as he shouted at Grace was still fresh in his memory. But Elizabeth was stubborn, and most of all, I needed to know the truth. In the garden, Grace remained sitting on the stone bench with her hands clasped in her lap. The security guards had relaxed a little, probably thinking she would give up. They were wrong. When Elizabeth appeared in the doorway, Grace looked up. For a moment, neither of them said anything. It was as if something invisible was connecting between the two. Elizabeth finally gathered her courage and took a few steps forward. "You said my name." Her voice was firm, but there was a tone of doubt. "How do you know me?" Grace smiled slightly, a smile filled with sadness and relief. "I've waited so long for this moment," Grace replied softly, as if speaking more to herself than to Elizabeth. "What does that mean? Who are you?" Elizabeth insisted, crossing her arms, trying to hide her nervousness. Grace sighed and looked directly into the young woman's eyes. "My name is Grace," she said, pausing for a moment. "And I've known your father for a long time, much longer than he would like to admit." Elizabeth was silent, trying to process what she was hearing. "And what do you want with him? Why did you come here?" he asked, trying to sound firm. "Because he needs to face what he did," Grace replied, her voice full of determination. "But more than that, you need to know the truth. He's not the man you think he is." Elizabeth felt the ground shake beneath her feet. She always admired her father. Charles was the pillar of the family, the man who built the Lancaster Empire with his own hands. How dare that woman say something like that? "My father is an honorable man," replied Elizabeth, trying to sound more confident than she felt. Grace leaned forward slightly, her eyes fixed on Elizabeth's. "He took everything I had from me," she said, her voice beginning to crack, "including the most precious thing I've ever had." Elizabeth opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Something about that statement left her unresponsive. Before he could ask further, Charles's voice echoed from across the garden. "Elizabeth!" he shouted, visibly furious. He came at a quick pace, and the security guards immediately positioned themselves between him and Grace. Elizabeth turned quickly, her heart racing. "What are you doing out here?" asked Charles, grabbing his daughter's arm. I told you not to listen to that woman." "Dad, who is she?" Elizabeth asked, her voice full of frustration. "Why does she speak as if she knows you so well?" "I already told you she's an opportunist," Charles shouted, more forcefully than he intended. "I don't want you near her. Let's go in now." Elizabeth tried to pull away, but Charles's hand was firm. Grace, however, did not back down. "You can scream all you want, Charles, but you can't change the past, and you can't erase the truth." Charles shot Grace a withering look, but didn't respond. He just pulled Elizabeth back into the mansion, while security guards took Grace out of the garden. Elizabeth, outraged, turned to her father as soon as they crossed the door. "You can't just ignore this," she exclaimed. "Who is this woman? What does she mean by all this?" Charles closed the door tightly and turned to face her. "You don't understand anything, Elizabeth. These people just want to destroy what we have." "But she talked about a daughter," Elizabeth insisted, looking at her father. "What does that mean? Father, tell me." But Charles was silent. His eyes were dark, and for an instant, Elizabeth saw something she had never seen before: fear. He ran a hand through his hair, trying to regain his composure. "Don't believe anything she says. She doesn't know what she's talking about," he finally said, before rushing out into the hallway. Elizabeth was left alone in the room, her heart racing and her mind full of doubts. Outside in the dark, Grace was forcibly removed by security guards. But even as they pushed her away, she knew she had accomplished something important. Elizabeth was now suspicious, and Grace knew that was the first step. Elizabeth didn't sleep that night. The woman's face, her pained voice, and her father's unusual reactions swirled through his mind like a tornado. For the first time in her life, she felt like she was facing something that could change everything she knew about her family. But no one seemed willing to tell him the truth. In the morning, the mansion was eerily silent. Charles, as always, left early, probably to avoid questions. Victoria, on the other hand, was in the lounge, sitting with a cup of coffee, her usual cold and distant expression. Elizabeth entered the room slowly, but she couldn't hide the weight on her shoulders. She knew she needed to face her mother, even if the answers were difficult to hear. "Good morning, Mother," he began with a more serious tone than usual. Victoria looked up from the newspaper and raised an eyebrow. "Elizabeth, did you sleep well?" he asked, but clearly didn't care about the answer. Elizabeth wasted no time with pleasantries. "I want to know who that woman was, Mom, and I want to know now." Victoria sighed, placing the cup on the table next to her. There was something in her posture that Elizabeth had never noticed before, a hint of weariness, perhaps even guilt. "We already talked about this yesterday, dear," Victoria replied calmly, but with the coldness that made Elizabeth want to scream. "That woman is just someone from your father's past. She doesn't matter." "Doesn't it matter?" Elizabeth replied, crossing her arms. She seemed to think otherwise. "And you seemed nervous yesterday too, Mom. You're hiding something from me, aren't you?" Victoria stared at her daughter for a moment, as if considering what to say. But in the end, she shook her head. "You are young, Elizabeth. He doesn't understand how the world works." She stood up, adjusting her skirt as if ending the conversation. "Not everything needs to be explained. Just trust your father." Elizabeth stood frozen as her mother left the room. She felt a mixture of frustration and anger. How could they expect her to ignore something like that? How could they pretend nothing was happening? Determined, Elizabeth picked up her bag and left the mansion without telling anyone. "I didn't know exactly where I was going, but I knew I needed to find that woman again." He needed to hear what Grace had to say without his father's interruptions and control. After driving aimlessly for almost an hour, he parked the car in a busy square and decided to walk. Her mind was so full of doubts that she barely noticed movement around her. It was then that he suddenly heard a familiar voice. "Elizabeth!" She turned and saw Grace sitting on a nearby bench. She looked exhausted, but she still had that determined look in her eyes. Elizabeth felt her heart race. "Are you following me?" she asked, confused. Grace shook her head. "No, but I'm surprised you came all this way." She gave a slight smile. "I knew you wouldn't believe his lies forever." Elizabeth hesitated, but ended up sitting next to Grace. They were silent for a moment as Elizabeth tried to find the right words. "Who are you?" he finally asked, his voice low. "And what do you really want from me?" Grace took a deep breath, as if that moment was the culmination of something she had been waiting for years. "I am someone who should be in your life, but who was ripped away from it by Charles Lancaster," he began, choosing his words carefully. "Your father took everything from me, Elizabeth, including you." Elizabeth blinked, confused. "I?" he repeated, without understanding. Grace nodded, her eyes teary. 20 years ago, I worked in that mansion. She was young, naive. Your father abused my trust, and when I found out I was pregnant, I thought he would do the right thing, but he didn't. He destroyed me." Elizabeth felt a chill run down her spine. "Are you saying that?" he began, but couldn't finish the sentence. Grace looked at her with an expression that mixed sadness and hope. "I am your mother, Elizabeth. Your real mother." The words echoed like thunder in Elizabeth's mind. She stood still, unable to process what she had just heard. "No, that can't be true." She shook her head, trying to dismiss the idea. "My father would never do something like that. My mother, Victoria." Grace placed her hand over Elizabeth's, a gesture that was hesitant but full of emotion. "I know it's hard to believe, but you need to hear the truth. Your father is not the man you think he is, and Victoria, she knew everything. She was part of it." Elizabeth stood up quickly, her heart racing and her hands shaking. "I don't know if I can believe you. This is crazy." "I have proof, Elizabeth." Grace also stood up, her voice firm. "I know you won't believe me with just words, but if you want to know the truth, I can show you." Elizabeth took a deep breath, looking at Grace. "I was torn between shock, anger, and curiosity. Everything she knew about her family seemed to be falling apart, but deep down, she knew she couldn't ignore it." "Show me," he said finally, his voice trembling. "Show me everything." Elizabeth was still in shock. Every word Grace spoke seemed to erode everything she believed about her life. But even overcome with doubt, she knew she needed to hear more. It was as if something inside her wanted to believe this woman. Maybe it was the sincere tone of his voice, or the look full of emotion. Maybe it was the strange feeling of familiarity he'd felt since seeing Grace for the first time. "What do you have to show me?" Elizabeth asked, trying to remain calm, but her voice was still shaking. Grace took out a small bag that was hidden under the seat and opened it carefully. From inside, he pulled out a stack of aged papers, some old photos, and a small wooden box that looked decades old. "This is all I was able to salvage from the time I worked for your family," Grace began, placing the items on the bench between them. "Letters, photos, records, things that Charles tried to destroy, but that I managed to keep." Elizabeth picked up one of the photos with shaking hands. It was a blurry image, but she recognized the young girl in it. It was Grace, much younger, smiling next to a small child, no more than 2 years old. "That's me?" Elizabeth asked, almost voiceless. Grace nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "You were 2 years old when Charles took you from me. He said I couldn't raise you, that you deserved a better life. But what he really wanted was to hide what he did. He wanted to erase any trace of me." Elizabeth felt her heart sink. It was hard to believe, but the photo looked so real. He looked at Grace, searching for answers. "And Victoria? Did she know that?" he asked, his voice full of emotion. Grace took a deep breath before responding. "Victoria knew everything from the beginning. She didn't want to accept you, but Charles convinced her that it would be better to raise you as their daughter. She never saw me as more than a threat." Elizabeth shook her head, trying to keep the tears away. It all seemed absurd, but there was something in the way Grace spoke, in the pain in her eyes, that made her believe it. Grace then took one of the papers from the pile and handed it to Elizabeth. "This is the original birth record," she said firmly. "You were born Elizabeth Grace. I chose your name before Charles changed it. Here is his name as father and mine as mother." Elizabeth took the paper carefully. His eyes flicked over the details, and there it was, Grace Williams and Charles Lancaster listed as the parents. "That can't be true," Elizabeth murmured, although now her doubts began to transform into something deeper. Grace held Elizabeth's hands gently. "I'm not here to destroy your life, Elizabeth. I'm here because you deserve to know the truth. I spent 20 years trying to get back on my feet, trying to find the strength to face them. I never wanted to lose you, but they took everything from me." Her voice trailed off for a moment, but she continued, "I just want you to know that I never stopped loving you." Elizabeth looked at Grace, her eyes teary. The pain in that woman's voice was palpable, and it hit her in a way she couldn't explain. "Why didn't you do this before? Why wait so long?" Elizabeth asked, with a mixed tone of anger and sadness. Grace sighed. "I tried, Elizabeth, but Charles used all the power he had to destroy me. He threatened me, humiliated me, made me look crazy. To this day, he would do anything to silence me." She paused, as if she needed to compose herself. "But now, after so long, I realize that I can't live another day without you knowing who I am." Elizabeth felt a mixture of emotions that made her dizzy. He wanted to believe Grace, but that meant admitting that his entire life was a lie. Suddenly, Elizabeth's cell phone vibrated. It was a message from Victoria. "Where are you? Come home immediately." Elizabeth ignored the message and put the papers and photo in Grace's bag. I don't know what to do with all this." Elizabeth looked at Grace, confused. "But I know I can't go home without answers." Grace nodded. "I don't expect you to make a decision now, but I promise you, Elizabeth, everything I said is true, and I'll be here when you're ready to face it." Elizabeth took a deep breath and stood up. He still didn't know who to trust, but he felt like he couldn't continue to ignore what was right in front of him. When she got back to the car, Elizabeth looked in the rearview mirror and saw Grace still sitting in the seat, watching her with eyes full of hope. It was impossible not to feel the weight of that connection. For the first time, Elizabeth realized that perhaps the perfect world she thought she lived in had never been real. The way back to the mansion seemed longer than ever. Elizabeth held the steering wheel tightly, trying to control the tears that insisted on falling. Grace's words echoed in her mind, along with the images of the photo and birth record. It all seemed impossible, but at the same time it made sense. Her father's reactions, her mother's nervousness. It was as if all the pieces were falling into place, revealing a truth she never wanted to imagine. As she parked at the mansion's entrance, Elizabeth took a deep breath. He needed to stay calm, even if his heart was racing. He entered through the main door, and the sound of hurried footsteps echoed in the hallway. It was Victoria, who appeared in the room with a face full of concern. "Where were you?" asked Victoria, crossing her arms. "Your absence did not go unnoticed." Elizabeth ignored her mother's tone and got straight to the point. "I was with her." His voice was firmer than he expected. Victoria frowned. "With whom?" he asked, but his expression betrayed nervousness. "With Grace Williams." Elizabeth took a few steps towards her mother. "The woman you and your father hid from me for 20 years. Victoria froze for a moment, but quickly regained her composure. "I don't know what you're talking about, Elizabeth. This woman is trying to poison your mind. You shouldn't listen to her." Elizabeth gave a dry laugh, full of bitterness. "Poison my mind?" he replied. "Then explain that." She pulled the birth record from her bag and handed it to Victoria. "Explain how her name appears as my mother in this document." Victoria paled. For a moment, it looked like she was going to collapse right there. But then, as always, he regained control. "It doesn't matter what she showed. These papers may be fake. You know people like her will do anything for money." "People like her?" Elizabeth interrupted, her voice rising. "Is that all you have to say? You knew that all along, didn't you? I knew she was my real mother." Victoria didn't respond immediately. Her eyes glittered with something between anger and shame, but she remained silent. That was all Elizabeth needed to confirm what she already knew. My God, you have lied to me my entire life. Elizabeth took a step back, feeling the ground shake. At that moment, Charles entered the room, attracted by the loud voices. When he saw Elizabeth holding the birth record, his expression hardened. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice cold. Elizabeth turned to him, her gaze full of tears and anger. "What is happening?" "I'm finally discovering who I am, Dad. Discovering that the woman you kicked out of here yesterday is my real mother." Charles closed the door tightly and walked towards her, trying to take the document, but Elizabeth backed away. "Who gave you this?" he asked, completely ignoring his daughter's question. "Does it matter?" shouted Elizabeth. "I want to know the truth, Father. I want to know what you did with her. Why did they lie to me?" Charles glanced at Victoria, who looked away, as if expecting him to take control of the situation. He then sighed and turned to Elizabeth. "We did what was best for you, Elizabeth." His voice was firm, but full of tension. "Grace couldn't take care of you. She was unstable, unpredictable. Everything we did was for your good." "For my own good." Elizabeth let out a bitter laugh. "You took a mother from her daughter and expect me to believe it was for my own good. You don't understand how the world works," Charles shouted, losing his patience. "Grace was a threat. She wanted to destroy everything we built." Elizabeth stared at him in disbelief. "A threat? She was my mother and you treated her like dirt. And me too, lying about who I am." Victoria finally intervened, trying to calm the situation. "Elizabeth, darling, we love you. We have always done our best for you. Don't let this woman mess with your head." "Love me?" Elizabeth shouted, her voice shaking. "Is love stealing a child from its mother and hiding the truth from her all her life? Is loving lying every day?" Charles took a step forward, but Elizabeth raised her hand as if to push him away. "No, I don't want to hear anything more from you. You betrayed me, both of you, and I will discover the whole truth with or without your help." With these words, Elizabeth ran out of the room, ignoring her mother's calls. He went upstairs and locked himself in his room, where he finally allowed the tears to fall. The birth record was still in his hands, irrefutable proof that his entire life had been built on lies. In the room, Charles and Victoria sat in silence, both trying to process what had just happened. Victoria looked at her husband reproachfully. "I told you this would happen. You should have dealt with this years ago." Charles didn't respond. He just grabbed a glass of whiskey and sat down, staring blankly at the wall. Outside, night was falling, and the glow of the Lancaster mansion seemed more fragile than ever. Elizabeth spent the night awake, sitting on the bedroom floor, with her back against the bed. She stared at the birth record as if it were a piece of an impossible puzzle to solve. Grace's words, the looks in her parents' eyes, the tension that had permeated every interaction since the party. It all made sense now. The lie that sustained her entire life was there, in front of her, and there was no way to ignore it. In the morning, when the first rays of sunlight broke through the curtains, Elizabeth made a decision. I needed definitive answers. He would no longer be content with half-truths or evasions. She quickly dressed, put the papers in her bag, and walked steadily downstairs. The mansion was silent, as if the corridors themselves felt the weight of the truth that hung in the air. Charles was in his office, the sound of ice clinking against the glass of whiskey, indicating that he had started the day the same way he had ended the night before. He barely looked up when Elizabeth slammed the door open. "What do you want now?" he asked dryly, without hiding his tiredness. Elizabeth crossed her arms, facing him like never before. "I want the truth, Father, and this time you're going to give it to me." His voice was firm, but his eyes were full of hurt. Charles sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I've already said everything I needed to. Grace is an unstable woman, an opportunist. She doesn't deserve your trust. And do you deserve it? Elizabeth replied, her eyes shining with anger. You lied to me my whole life. Don't give me that story that you did it out of love. This was about control, about power. Charles narrowed his eyes, anger beginning to show. Be careful what you say, Elizabeth. I am your father. It will be? Elizabeth returned, taking a step forward. Because right now you seem more like a stranger. Charles didn't respond. He just turned his face away, avoiding her gaze. Elizabeth knew in that instant that he had nothing left to offer. She picked up her bag, turned and left the office without looking back. In the hallway, Victoria was standing, watching everything. Her eyes were filled with something that looked like guilt, but Elizabeth no longer had the patience to deal with it. He walked straight past, took the car keys, and left the mansion. Grace was in her small house in the city's simplest neighborhood, a stark contrast to the opulence of the Lancasters. When he heard the sound of a car parking outside, he looked out the window and saw Elizabeth coming out, looking like a storm about to break out. Grace opened the door before Elizabeth could knock. You came, Grace said, surprised, but with a trace of relief in her voice. Elizabeth entered without hesitation. He looked around and saw a small space full of simplicity, but clean and cozy. In the center of the room, a table with more papers and old photos scattered around. I have no more doubts, said Elizabeth, looking at Grace. I need to know everything. From the beginning. I want to know who you are, who I am, and what my father did to hide it. Grace nodded, asking Elizabeth to sit down. He got her a cup of tea and started talking. I was very young when I started working at the Lancaster household, Grace began, her voice full of emotion. It was a good opportunity, and I needed to help my family. But I quickly realized that Charles was not the man he appeared to be. He had a dark side. He controlled everyone around him. And when he started showing interest in me, I was too young to understand the danger. Elizabeth was silent, absorbing every word. When I found out I was pregnant, I thought he would do the right thing. He promised he would take care of us, but they were lies. When you were born, he acted quickly. He said I wasn't capable of taking care of you, that you deserved a better life. He threatened me, Elizabeth. He said that if I tried to fight, he would finish me off. Grace paused, her eyes filling with tears. Elizabeth held her cup tightly, her hands shaking. He forced me to leave town, ruined my reputation, took me away from everything, but I never gave up on you. Years later, I returned in secret, began to gather the evidence, waiting for the day when I could look into his eyes and tell the truth. Elizabeth set the cup on the table and ran her hands over her face, trying to process everything. He took you from me, Elizabeth. It took away from both of us the chance to be a family. And Victoria? She knew everything. He was an accomplice. Grace paused and looked at Elizabeth. But now that you know, the choice is yours. I can't force you into anything, but I needed you to know who I really am. Elizabeth was silent for a long moment. Her eyes met Grace's, and for the first time, she felt like she was looking at someone who could actually be her mother. But at the same time, the pain and confusion still weighed heavily on his chest. I need time, Elizabeth said finally. This is a lot to process. Grace nodded, understanding. I understand, but I will be here always. Elizabeth stood up, her heart heavy and her mind in turmoil. When he left the house, he knew there was no going back to his old life. Whatever he did from then on, he would be driven by the truth he now carried. Elizabeth drove aimlessly through the city, the weight of the revelations crushing her mind. On the one hand, Grace's words seemed true, filled with emotion and evidence that couldn't be ignored. On the other hand, Standing up to Charles and Victoria would mean destroying everything she knew as her family. The idea of exposing that truth, of ripping off the Lancastrian mask, was terrifying. But something inside her knew it needed to be done. Finally, he stopped at a cafe. He ordered tea that he barely touched and spent hours looking out the window, trying to find a way through the tangle of lies that his life had become. As the sky began to darken, she made a decision. She would no longer let Charles control the narrative. He should be confronted publicly, where he could not lie or escape. And, above all, Elizabeth wanted clear, blunt answers. With the plan formed, Elizabeth returned to the mansion, determined to start the confrontation that same night. Charles was in the office, as always, reviewing documents that he probably couldn't even process due to the tension of the last few days. When Elizabeth entered without knocking, he looked up, irritated. "It's late, Elizabeth. Don't you think you should be resting?" he said with an impatient tone. "I won't rest until you tell me everything, the whole truth. And this time, I want it in front of everyone." Elizabeth's voice was firm but full of emotion. Charles narrowed his eyes, sensing she was up to something. "I don't see the need for a new conversation. I already said what I needed. No, you gave me lies." "But that's over." Elizabeth crossed her arms. "I want you and Victoria in the main room, now." "Elizabeth, I will not tolerate that tone," began Charles, but she interrupted him. "Either you come down now, or I myself will make a point of telling the truth to every person I know, starting with your business partners. What do you prefer?" The threat was enough for Charles. He knew Elizabeth wasn't bluffing. After a moment of hesitation, he stood up, grabbing his jacket from the chair. "You're playing with fire, Elizabeth," he murmured as he walked through the door. Elizabeth did not respond. He just followed his father to the main hall, where Victoria was already waiting for them, sitting on the sofa with a tense face. "What is happening?" Victoria asked, looking at her husband with a trace of irritation. "Elizabeth thinks she needs more answers," said Charles, as he sat down in the armchair. "And apparently he wants a show." "A spectacle?" Elizabeth let out a bitter laugh. "It's not a show, it's my life, and you two turned her into a lie." Victoria narrowed her eyes but didn't respond. Elizabeth took a deep breath and took the papers out of her bag, placing them on the coffee table. "This is the evidence Grace gave me. The original birth record, the photos, everything." She looked at them defiantly. "Now, I want to hear from you. Why did they do this? Why did you hide the truth from me?" Charles looked at the papers with an expression that mixed anger and exhaustion. Victoria looked uncomfortable, but kept her gaze cool. "You already know the story, Elizabeth. We did what was necessary," Charles finally replied, his voice low. "Necessary?" Elizabeth exploded, standing up. Was taking a mother from her daughter and lying to her entire life necessary? Do you think you can decide what is best for everyone as if you were gods? "Grace could never offer you what we offer," shouted Charles, finally losing patience. "She was a maid. You would never have had the life you had with her. That wasn't your decision," Elizabeth countered, her eyes shining with anger. "You destroyed her life and mine, all because of your pride, your damn control." Victoria intervened, her voice calm but sharp. "Elizabeth, you are getting carried away by emotion. Grace is not the innocent victim you think. She knew exactly what she was getting into." "You knew?" Elizabeth turned to her mother in disbelief. "So she knew you were going to steal her daughter? Did you know that I would be treated like trash by you?" "No, Mother. What she knew was that you would do anything to protect your reputation." Victoria looked away, which only confirmed what Elizabeth already knew. Charles stood up, adjusting his jacket. "Let's not discuss this anymore. Grace is a shadow of the past, and that is where she must return. You are making a mistake by bringing this up." Elizabeth looked at him, with tears in her eyes. "The only mistake here was trusting you. But that's over. I won't live another lie. And I will fight so that Grace also has the chance to tell her story." "And what do you intend to do?" asked Charles with sarcasm in his voice. "Destroy your own family because of a woman you barely know?" Elizabeth smiled bitterly. "You have already destroyed this family. I'm just going to bring the truth out. And this time, no one will shut me up." She took the papers and left the room, leaving Charles and Victoria in silence, both visibly shaken. In the hallway, Elizabeth felt a wave of relief mixed with fear. He knew he was crossing a line that would change his life forever, but for the first time, he felt like he was in control. Elizabeth knew she couldn't face this battle alone. Charles and Victoria were powerful, used to manipulating situations to their advantage, and would not hesitate to do the same again. But she also knew that the truth was on her side, and that gave her the courage to act. The next morning, Elizabeth went to meet Grace. She knocked on the door of the simple house, and Grace greeted her with a look of surprise and relief. "I knew you'd be back," Grace said, holding the door open. "We need to talk," Elizabeth replied, entering. "And this time, I want a plan. I won't allow my parents to continue lying, but I need your help so the truth comes out." Grace nodded, sitting at the table with Elizabeth. It was clear that the young woman was determined, but also nervous. "What do you have in mind?" asked Grace, placing her hand on Elizabeth's to reassure her. Elizabeth took a deep breath before responding. "I don't know if they will be held responsible for everything they did, but I want the world to know. I want everyone to see what my father is capable of doing to protect his own image. If Charles and Victoria don't want the truth revealed, I'll do it for them." Grace was silent for a moment, studying Elizabeth's face. Despite the pain and confusion, she saw strength in the young woman, a strength that came perhaps from both. "And how do you intend to do that?" Grace finally asked. "We need witnesses, people who know what happened or who can confirm your story. And we need the media. A public complaint may be our only chance to prevent them from huffing it up again." Grace hesitated. Involving other people meant taking risks, but at the same time, I knew Elizabeth was right. Charles wouldn't give up without a fight, and they needed to be prepared. "I know someone who can help," Grace said finally. "A former maid at the mansion. She was there when it all happened and saw what Charles did to me. Her name is Martha. She left there shortly after me, but still lives in the city." Elizabeth's eyes sparkled with new hope. "Do you think she would agree to talk?" Grace nodded. "Martha has always been a fair woman. If she knows you want the truth, I think she'll help us." Elizabeth and Grace spent the afternoon together, reviewing the evidence and discussing the plan. The connection between them grew with each moment, as if the years of separation were slowly erased by the determination to make amends for the past. When Grace finally managed to get in touch with Martha, the response was immediate. The former employee agreed to meet them the next day in a small cafe in the city center. That night, back at the mansion, Elizabeth faced a heavy environment. Charles barely spoke to her, and Victoria, as always, remained cool and distant. But Elizabeth knew they felt control slipping from their hands, and that made her stronger. Before going up to her room, Elizabeth stopped at the entrance to the office, where Charles was sitting, staring into a glass of whiskey. "Father," she said, her voice firm, "tomorrow I'm going to find someone who can confirm everything Grace told me. There's still time for you to do the right thing. Tell the truth." Charles looked up slowly, his eyes dark with anger. "You're playing against your own family, Elizabeth." His voice was low, but full of threat. "Don't forget that everything you have Everything you are came from me." Elizabeth stepped forward, undeterred. "And all of this was built on lies. I don't want any more of this if it means continuing to live in the shadow of what you did." Charles gripped the glass tightly but didn't respond. Elizabeth turned her back and went up the stairs, feeling her heart beating faster. I knew Charles wouldn't stand still. He would do anything to stop the truth from coming out, but this time she was prepared. The next morning, Elizabeth and Grace arrived at the cafe where Martha was waiting for them. The woman, now with grey hair and a weathered face, stood up to greet them. His smile was warm, but his gaze carried something more, a silent understanding that this encounter would bring back difficult memories. "It's good to see you, Grace," Martha said, shaking her hand. "And you too, Martha. Thanks for coming." Grace looked at Elizabeth. "This is Elizabeth, my daughter." Martha looked at Elizabeth with tenderness and surprise. "You're a lot like she was when she was young," Martha said, sitting down again. "So how can I help?" Grace took a deep breath and began to tell her everything that had happened from the beginning. When he finished, Martha was silent, her gaze fixed on her coffee cup. "I remember everything," Martha said finally. "I saw how he treated you, Grace. I saw when he threatened you and when you left. And of course I watched as he brought Elizabeth into the house as if she were his and Victoria's daughter." Elizabeth felt a knot in her stomach. Hearing those words from someone else made it all the more real. "Would you be willing to speak publicly?" asked Elizabeth. "Your testimony could be the key to other people believing Grace's story." Martha hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. "If it means justice for you, Grace, and for you, Elizabeth, I'm willing to talk. It's not fair what he did to any of you." Elizabeth felt tears run down her face, but this time she didn't try to hide them. Finally, he felt the truth was within his reach. The cafe, small and modest, seemed to be the stage for something much bigger that morning. With Martha's words still echoing in her mind, Elizabeth felt a mixture of relief and urgency. Every detail of that woman's testimony was like a piece of a puzzle that was finally beginning to come together. Grace, at her side, held her shaking hands, but there was a sparkle in her eyes, a glimmer of hope that she hadn't felt in years. "This won't be easy, Elizabeth," said Martha after a reflective silence. "Charles is powerful, and you know what he is capable of doing. But if you are determined, I will be by your side." Elizabeth nodded, determined. "He can try to silence me, but he can't erase the truth. This time, let's face it, together." Martha agreed, and, after working out the details, the three women left the cafe with renewed strength. But Elizabeth knew this was just the beginning. The real battle was yet to come. Back at the Lancaster mansion, Charles was in his office, phone in hand. His tone was low but charged with urgency. "I want you to find out where she was today, who she saw, who she spoke to. I don't want any surprises," he ordered, before hanging up. Victoria entered the room soon after, her expression full of concern. "Charles, this is going too far. You know Elizabeth won't give up. Maybe it's time to tell everything." His voice was almost a whisper. Charles looked at her coldly. "Tell everything and throw everything we built in the trash? Never." He stood up, pacing around the office like a cornered animal. "I didn't come this far to see everything fall apart because of Grace and her lies." Victoria didn't respond. She knew that Charles would never admit his mistakes, and that was beginning to scare her. For the first time, she saw her husband as someone who was willing to do anything to protect his legacy, even if it meant destroying his own family. Elizabeth wasted no time. That afternoon, she got in touch with a local journalist, known for exposing scandals among the city's rich families. When he answered the phone, his curiosity was immediately piqued. "Elizabeth Lancaster?" "What can I do for you?" he asked, with a slightly skeptical tone. "I have a story for you," Elizabeth replied, her voice firm. "One that will shake the entire city." The journalist agreed to meet her that same night. Elizabeth, Grace, and Martha spent the next few hours gathering all the evidence they had, every photo, every document, every word of Martha's testimony. When the journalist arrived at the agreed location, Elizabeth was ready. "Is this serious?" he asked, leafing through the papers Elizabeth had handed over. "Do you know what you're saying about your father?" "I know exactly what I'm saying." Elizabeth crossed her arms, looking him straight in the eyes. "He took my mother from me, destroyed her life, and lied to me for years. I want the truth to be published, and I want it to be done in such a way that he cannot escape." The journalist nodded, impressed by both the story and Elizabeth's determination. "This is going to be big," he said, putting the documents in his briefcase. "But you need to be ready for what's to come. Once this story comes out, there's no going back." Elizabeth looked at Grace and Martha. The two women nodded, silently supporting her. "We're ready," Elizabeth replied. Across town, Charles received the call he had been dreading. "Mr. Lancaster, it appears your daughter is working with a journalist. They're preparing something big," said the voice on the other end of the line. Charles felt his blood run cold. He knew Elizabeth wasn't joking, but he never imagined she would go this far. "Don't let it out," he ordered, his voice full of anger. "Pay what you have to. Do whatever it takes. Just stop it from happening." But it was already too late. The next morning, the city woke up to the news plastered across all local newspapers and websites. The Lancasters' dark secret, the true story behind the city's most powerful family. The article detailed everything: Charles's abuse of Grace, his manipulation to keep her from his daughter, and the years of lies that sustained the Lancaster empire. There were photos, documents, and Martha's testimony, which corroborated every word. At the mansion, Charles held the newspaper with shaking hands, while Victoria read the article in silence beside him. For the first time, the silence between them wasn't comfortable. It was an abyss. "This can't be happening," Charles muttered, his voice cracking for the first time. "This is happening, Charles, and you have only yourself to blame," Victoria replied, her voice full of bitterness. Outside, journalists and curious people began to gather at the mansion's gates. Elizabeth, who had spent the night with Grace, knew that morning would be a turning point. "They'll never be able to hide the truth again," Grace said, holding Elizabeth's hand. Elizabeth smiled, although her eyes still held sadness. "It doesn't matter what happens now. We did what was right." As the two looked out the window, Martha arrived with a coffee in her hands and a comforting smile. "You are stronger than you know," she said. Outside, camera flashes and the sound of reporters' questions echoed in the morning. For the first time, the Lancastrian Empire began to crumble. The Lancaster mansion, once a symbol of power and wealth, was now surrounded by journalists, cameras, and onlookers. The article had spread like wildfire, dragging Charles and Victoria's names into the center of a scandal the city would never forget. Inside, the silence was almost unbearable. Charles was in the office, facing the wall with the newspaper open on the table. Victoria, sitting on the sofa, didn't say a word. What could they say? The whole truth was exposed. The empire that Charles was so proud of was now crumbling before his eyes. "This is your fault," Charles said finally, breaking the silence. "You should never have let Elizabeth get close to that woman." Victoria laughed, but the sound was empty, full of bitterness. "My fault?" she replied. "You destroyed that woman, lied to our daughter, and now you want to put it on me." "No, Charles, this is your work." Before he could respond, the door slammed open. Elizabeth entered, accompanied by Grace. The two were together, side by side, and their gazes were firm. "This needs to stop," Elizabeth said, her voice cutting through the silence. Charles stood up, his face red with anger. "You have no idea what you did, Elizabeth. He threw our family to the lions. You allied with this woman to destroy everything we built. What you built was a farce," Elizabeth countered, approaching. "And if you think you're going to get away with it, you're very mistaken. The truth needed to be told. No more lies." Grace, beside Elizabeth, stared at Charles with eyes full of pain, but also determination. "You took everything from me, Charles, but it won't shut me up anymore. Finally, the world knows what you did." Charles laughed, but the sound was full of despair. "And what will you gain from this, Grace?" he asked. "Did you think exposing all of this would make you a hero? You will always be nobody." Grace stepped forward, her voice firm. "I didn't do it for myself. I did it for Elizabeth, because she deserves to know the truth, and because you need to face what you did." Victoria, who until then had been silent, finally stood up. "Elizabeth," he began, his voice trembling. "I know I made a mistake. I know I participated in this lie, but I never wanted to hurt you." She looked at Grace. "And although I didn't act as I should have, I never wanted things to come to that." Elizabeth stared at her, emotionless. "You could have stopped this, Mom. I could have told the truth at any time, but he chose to stay by his side. He chose the comfort of lies." Victoria looked down, unable to respond. For the first time, he seemed to realize how much he had lost. "Charles Lancaster," Elizabeth said, turning to her father, "you can no longer control the narrative. The world already knows what you did. And if you think it will end here, you are wrong. I will make sure you pay for everything." Charles laughed bitterly. "Do you think the world cares about this? Powerful people fall and get up all the time. I won't lose. Not for you, not for her." He pointed at Grace. Elizabeth shook her head sadly. "You already lost, Dad, and he hasn't realized it yet." Outside, camera flashes illuminated Elizabeth's face as she and Grace walked out of the mansion's main entrance together. Journalists shouted questions, but Elizabeth stood her ground. "What do you have to say about the accusations against Charles Lancaster?" shouted one of them. Elizabeth stopped, took a deep breath and responded, her voice clear and strong. "The truth has been told, and my father's actions will have consequences. What matters now is that Grace, my real mother, finally gets the recognition and peace she deserves." The reporters continued shouting, but Elizabeth and Grace moved on, ignoring the chaos around them. That night, back in Grace's simple home, Elizabeth felt a sense of lightness for the first time. Not because the problem was resolved, there was still a long way to go, but because the lie that had suffocated her for so many years had finally been ripped away. Grace placed a cup of tea in Elizabeth's hands and sat down next to her. "I know this isn't the end," Grace said, her voice soft. "But watching you fight for the truth is more than I could ask for." Elizabeth smiled, holding Grace's hand. "It doesn't matter what happens now. We did the right thing." Grace nodded, tears in her eyes, as the two shared a peaceful moment. And so ends this exciting story, full of twists and turns. But what about you? What would you do in Elizabeth's place? Would you be able to face everything, to seek the truth? Leave your opinion in the comments and share this video with those who love impactful stories. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel True Impressive Stories for more stories like this. The truth has the power to change lives, and we are here to tell it. Until next time.